I'm Indy and this is another exciting Great War on the Road special episode. Now, we are in Slovenia today, filming a bunch of stuff, and I have another special guest for you guys. Now, could you please tell everybody out there who you are, what you do, and where we are?
Okay, so my name is Jaka Fili. We are in Kobarid Museum, and I'm a guide in this museum. Now, since you do this about First World War, I think that I don't have to explain why World War I started and everything. We can move directly to the battles here. Okay. So the situation like this was established in first days or weeks of First World War on this front line, and then it remained exactly the same for the next 2 years. Italians launched 11 offensives. Here, nothing changed. The biggest changes happened here actually before the first official battle started. Immediately after the beginning of the war between Italy and Austria-Hungary, Austro-Hungarian soldiers retreated over the river Socha to the mountaintops above the left bank of river Socha. When Italians came here, they conquered Kobarid without a fight. Then they managed to conquer Mount Kern range, and 2/3 of Batognica, but then everything stopped because terrain here is pretty difficult. Mountains are high and steep, and so with the old kinds of tactics, with the frontal assaults, it was impossible to achieve anything. Yeah. Even if in some sector, for example, here on Mount Merzli or on Mount Batognica, and both armies were about 10 meters apart. So the Italian plan was to advance from Mount Batognica in the valley of river Tolminka and to attack the Austro-Hungarian forces on the Tolmin bridgehead from behind. This bridgehead was extremely important, basically fundamental for Austro-Hungarians, because here is valley of river Idrica, where it's also the railway, the only railway here, which was crucial for the supply lines of Austro-Hungarian army. As we heard before, Italians didn't manage to do it. They couldn't breach the Austro-Hungarian defenses around Batognica. So for 2 years, both armies were fighting here, soldiers were dying here, soldiers were suffering here, nothing really changed. A little bit different was the situation more to the south.
Yeah, sure, Gorizia.
Gorizia, Carso, and so on. There, Italians on this front line, they launched 11 offensives. Here, without a result. More to the south, they conquered some territory, but more importantly was that in those 11 battles, there were hundreds of thousands of people killed and wounded. And the Austro-Hungarian army already lost a lot of men in Serbia and in Russia. And because of this, after the 11th Italian offensive, Austro-Hungarian army became so weak that Austrian generals knew that if Italians launch another attack, it will be over. The Austria-Hungary will be defeated and the war will end. So they asked for help their allies Germans, and together they prepared the famous Battle of Kobarid. Well, we've arrived in the White Room. Why the White Room? You can see in the photos a lot of snow. This room shows the life of the soldiers up in the mountains. Yeah. And we have to know that during World War I, winters were much harsher than today. Actually, the winters during World War I were one of the coldest in the whole century. And so the situation up in our mountains was very, very tough because front line was passing mountaintops that are more than 2,000 meters high, and there could be more than 10 meters of snow. Temperatures descended below -25, -30 degrees centigrade, and over mountaintops was blowing the wind with a speed of more than 100 kilometers per hour. So the conditions were almost like in Siberia. And the equipment of soldiers was, well, to say the least, terrible. You can see here, one Austro-Hungarian soldier. You see that they didn't have modern materials like Gore-Tex and Windstopper and these kind of things, but just wool and cotton.
Would they use like grease or fat on their faces or skin to block the wind?
Yes. And well, if they had a little bit of luck, they could have a fur coat like the Italian soldier on the other photos. So, but even those fur coats, they were not enough. Because we have to know the conditions for living of soldiers. All of the summer positions, all of the trenches, caverns, bunkers, everything was covered by snow. So soldiers had to dig new positions directly into snow, and from time to time they were basically living under the open sky, in open trenches like this. Yeah. You can imagine that it was not very easy, and because of this, soldiers preferred digging these kind of snow tunnels, because in those tunnels there was no wind, no wind chill. They had a feeling that inside is much warmer than outside. Yeah. But those tunnels had one very big problem. If an enemy shell or hand grenade hit it, it collapsed, and soldiers remained trapped under the snow. This also brings us to another very big problem of winter warfare. You can imagine that 10 meters of snow is very unstable, and so every winter there are lots of avalanches, and a lot of those avalanches also claimed a lot of human lives. The interesting thing is that during winter time, soldiers didn't fight against each other. The conditions were so difficult that there were no battles during winter. But even so, every winter claimed thousands and thousands of human lives just because the soldiers were poorly equipped and because conditions were so severe. When the soldiers started to fight, they had to have enormous quantities of munitions. For example, at the beginning of World War I in 1914, Austro-Hungarian army every day used more than 6 million bullets. And this number just went up. And so we calculated that during the war, every division, this means about 12,000 men, needed to have at least 200 tons of supplies every single day. And just in Upper Socha Valley, just on Italian side, there were at least 6 divisions. Thousands and thousands of tons of supplies had to be brought up from valleys up to the mountains every single day. And at the beginning of the war, it was very difficult because here were not even hiking trails. Here was nothing. So soldiers first had to construct these simple military roads on which they were transporting supplies by mules even on their own backs. But those supply routes were never enough, so soldiers had to start to build this kind of simple cable carts. Those cable carts or ropeways, they were very simple, made out of wood, but they were pretty effective, and they were used for transporting supplies, but also to transport wounded people and to transport cannons. And the interesting thing is that those roads and those cable ropeways are still in use in one way, because today if you go hiking in our mountains, basically all hiking trails are put on former military roads. You can still see today that those hiking trails, once upon a time, they were much wider and well maintained, and they are not too steep.
Okay.
Those cable cars, they don't exist anymore because they were dismantled after the war. But the local population collected everything that was still useful. They collected barbed wire for pastures, they collected scrap metal for selling, and they also collected those cables. And even today, those small wooden bridges in Upper Socha Valley, some of them are still hanging on cables from World War I.
Yeah.
So we may say that military material in this valley is still in use in one way. Yeah. Okay, so now we've come to the room of the rear, and here we will briefly explain the life of the soldiers in the rear when they were not on the front line.
Okay.
Because during the war, front line was in the Kern range in this direction, and so Kobarid was in the rear of Italian army. And Kobarid became an extremely important logistical hub for the Italian army because basically all of the supplies for the Italian army in Upper Socha Valley came from Kobarid. And those supplies had to be brought to Kobarid, and because of this, Italian army actually constructed a 25-kilometer long railway from the city of Cividale across the border, almost until Kobarid, just to supply their troops. So this valley was, back in the day, it was completely unrecognizable, because today the city of Kobarid has about 1,000 inhabitants.
Okay.
Back in the day, just in this valley, there were more than 100,000 Italian soldiers. So population was 100 times bigger than today, and the valley was full of soldiers, full of hospitals, full of warehouses, full of barackments, full of everything.
Full of everything, yeah.
First thing that soldiers did when they found out where the front line will be was that they constructed a lot of field hospitals.
Yeah.
Started with field hospitals in tents, in barracks, and those hospitals were never enough. So soldiers improvised even further, and they constructed hospitals in existing buildings, in churches, in schools, in factories. Over there you can see Austro-Hungarian Austro-Hungarian hospital in Trieste. You can see just one very big room with a lot of beds. You can imagine that hygienic conditions in this kind of hospitals were not very good. So a lot of wounds got infected, and a lot of soldiers died because of wounds that were not even dangerous, but because they got infected, they became lethal. And even with these very poor hygienic conditions, military surgeons a lot of times performed real miracles, extremely complex surgeries. For example, over there is a surgery on the skull. In the rear, soldiers also wanted to forget about the war, and to do this, they did different social activities, and they constructed different social objects. So, for example, they had football fields, they had improvised cinemas, they had concerts, barber shops, brothels, everything to try to forget about the horrors of the war. Now, during First World War, Austria-Hungary was fighting on 3 fronts, against Italy, against Serbia, and against Russia. And we know what 3 fronts means. 3 fronts equals a lot of casualties. And the Austro-Hungarian army had a casualty rate so big that after a couple of years, the whole empire didn't have enough men to call them in the army to replace all of the casualties, and so they started to call older and younger people. And on this front line, they ended like this, with the oldest and youngest soldier of Isonzo Front.
Wow.
Oldest had 65 years, youngest just 11. Now we have to be honest. This 11-year-old was not a conscript. He was a volunteer. We actually know his life story. He was called Ales Dervišević from Bosnia.
Yeah.
His older brother was killed in first days of war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. So I don't know how did he do it, but he volunteered in the army to avenge his brother. He survived First World War, he also survived Second World War, and he died, I think, 30 or 40 years ago in Dubai. So he had quite an interesting life.
Well, first I have to say really big thanks for taking time to go around and show us. Now, we'll put links to the museum below, but you should definitely check it out because we have only just scratched the surface of what there is here in the museum about the front, about the war in general, about the history of the region, and of course, about the actual battle itself. You owe it to yourselves when you're down here in Slovenia, or even if you're in northern Italy, or heck, if you're in Austria, if you're anywhere within 400 kilometers and you don't come, he'll hunt you down, and I won't say he'll kill you while you sleep, but I'm thinking it, okay? If you'd like to see our special about Erwin Rommel, you can click right here for that special. And do not forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, and all your dreams will come true. See you next time.